No one noticed the human smiling. Not when the verdict was spoken, its voice cold, precise, and absolute, echoing through the immeasurable expanse of the Galactic Council chamber like a law carved into the bones of reality itself. The sound didn't just travel through air. It resonated through translation fields, neural interfaces, and quantum-linked consciousness streams. Every species present heard it in the language they trusted most, and accepted it without question, not when the lights dimmed. The chamber responded to judgment the way it always had, illumination lowering in slow ceremonial descent, casting long, fractured shadows across towering alien forms and shimmering constructs of living data. It was a ritual older than most civilizations present, designed to remind every witness of the same truth. The Council did not decide outcomes. It confirmed inevitabilities, and not when entire star systems, billions of lives, histories, futures, were quietly reassigned within the glowing lattice of the verdict core above. Borders shifted. Access corridors closed. Expansion rights revoked. All of it happening in elegant silence, like a surgeon removing possibility from the body of a species without leaving visible scars. No one questioned it. They never did, because in this chamber emotion was considered interference. Reaction was inefficiency, and empathy was a flaw most species had long since evolved beyond. So no one looked for it. No one expected it, and no one noticed the human. Ambassador Leon Reyes stood at the center of the chamber, small by comparison to the towering delegates around her. Her presence barely registered against the vast scale of the environment, just another representative of a young, statistically insignificant species awaiting classification. She should have looked defeated. That was the pattern. That was the expectation. Species brought before the Council, especially those placed under restriction, followed predictable emotional trajectories: shock, denial, anger, sometimes desperation. Rarely acceptance, never stillness. But Leon Reyes did not follow the pattern. Her posture remained steady, her breathing slow, her gaze lifted, not in defiance, not in submission, but in quiet observation, as though she were watching something unfold that no one else in the chamber had yet realized was happening. And then the smallest shift, barely visible. The corner of her mouth lifted. Not enough to draw attention. Not enough to trigger behavioral analysis systems. Not enough to register as a significant emotional event within the Council's vast network of predictive models. But it was there. A smile, not proud, not mocking, not even particularly expressive. Just certain. Around her, the chamber continued exactly as it always had. Delegates recalibrated their attention toward the next agenda point. Data streams updated. The verdict core pulsed with quiet authority, already moving beyond humanity's fate as if it had never been in doubt. Everything functioned perfectly, efficiently, predictably, and yet, something had already gone wrong. Not in the systems, not in the verdict, not in the execution of control, but in a detail too small for the Council to prioritize. Because in a place where everything was measured, predicted, and contained, they had overlooked the one variable that refused to announce itself. A human, standing in the center of the galaxy's greatest authority, smiling. The Council chamber did not simply exist, it dominated space. Suspended at the gravitational dead center of a collapsed galaxy cluster, it stretched beyond conventional scale, its architecture layered in concentric tiers that spiraled upward into a haze of distant light. Platforms drifted in perfect synchronization, each carrying representatives of civilizations older than most stars, still burning in the visible sky. Some delegates were physical, towering, armored, biologically immense. Others existed as projections, fractal intelligences woven from data and light, their forms constantly shifting as if reality struggled to hold them in one shape. Every surface carried history. The walls were not walls but living records, dense with embedded quantum inscriptions that replayed past verdicts in silent loops. Empires erased, alliances formed, entire species reduced to footnotes in the Council's endless calculus. If one stood still long enough, the chamber itself seemed to breathe with memory. At its center hovered the verdict core, a colossal sphere of layered energy and matter rotating slowly with impossible precision. It was not just a machine. It was consensus made manifest, a synthesis of countless civilizations' logic, ethics, and strategic doctrine compressed into something that no single species could challenge. Its surface shimmered with shifting constellations of data, each pulse representing a decision being formed, refined, and enforced across the galaxy in real time, and beneath it stood a human, Ambassador Leon Reyes. She looked almost fragile in comparison to the vastness surrounding her. No exosuit, no augmentation visible, no projection amplification, just a simple diplomatic uniform, dark, unadorned, absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. To most species present, she barely registered as a physical presence. To the Council's predictive systems, she was categorized as low-threat, low-influence, non-dominant actor, and yet attention kept returning to her, not consciously, but repeatedly, like a variable that refused to stay in the background. Her mission had been simple, at least on paper: represent Earth, accept the Council's evaluation, negotiate where possible. It was a ritual every emerging species endured, the moment where they were measured, categorized, and quietly placed into the galactic hierarchy. Most fought it. Some resisted openly. Others attempted manipulation, alliances, strategic concessions. A few even tried to threaten the Council, believing force could alter outcome. None succeeded, because the Council did not operate on reaction, it operated on inevitability, and now humanity had reached that moment. Above her, the verdict core pulsed, its light shifting subtly as it processed the final layers of Earth's classification. Around her, the delegates watched with varying degrees of interest, some with detached curiosity, some with quiet anticipation, a few, very few, with something closer to concern, because humans had not followed expected patterns since their arrival. They adapted too quickly, learned too aggressively, and perhaps most unsettling of all, they asked questions that didn't fit inside the Council's frameworks. Leon Reyes stood still, her eyes tracing the slow rotation of the core. She could feel the weight of its attention, not as pressure, but as analysis. Every breath measured, every micro-expression catalogued, every possibility of her response already mapped across probability trees branching into infinity. This was the moment where she was supposed to react, to show fear, to show resistance, to confirm the Council's predictions about what humanity was. Instead, she simply waited, calm, composed, and somewhere deep within that stillness, something quiet, deliberate, and entirely human held its ground. Because while the Council believed it was about to define humanity, Leon Reyes already understood something they did not. This wasn't the moment Earth was being judged. It was the moment the galaxy was about to reveal what it had failed to see. The Sol system will remain under provisional restriction. The words did not echo. They settled, heavy, absolute, and final, like gravity increasing without warning. Across the Galactic Council chamber, translation fields carried the verdict into 1,000 forms of understanding at once. Sound, light, chemical pulses, direct neural imprint. No matter the medium, the meaning arrived unchanged. Restriction, a soft word for a slow death. Above Ambassador Leon Reyes, the verdict core pulsed once, its surface dimming in ceremonial confirmation. Lines of light branched outward across the chamber's embedded star maps, quietly redrawing humanity's future. Expansion corridors collapsed. Trade pathways sealed. Access nodes grayed out one by one like distant stars being erased from existence. It was clean, efficient, merciless in its precision. Around her, the chamber responded in subtle shifts. Delegates adjusted posture not out of emotion but recalibration. To them, this was not cruelty. It was balance. The Council did not punish species, it managed them. And humanity, in their eyes, had been placed exactly where it belonged, contained. But beneath that calculated calm, something else stirred. Attention. The Threx observers angled their massive forms slightly inward, their layered vision systems narrowing focus. The Veil Collective's luminous patterns flickered, fragmenting briefly as shared cognition attempted to reconcile expectation with observation. Even the synthetic adjudicators, beings that did not feel, allocated additional processing cycles toward a single anomaly at the center of the chamber. The human, they were waiting. Waiting for the reaction, because reactions were data, predictable, measurable, useful. A species facing restriction followed patterns. Historical models confirmed it. Emotional spikes, defensive arguments, desperate negotiations. Each response mapped cleanly into the Council's understanding of behavioral inevitability. And humanity had already shown signs of instability. Too adaptive, too curious, too unwilling to settle into predefined roles. This was the moment that would define them. Leon Reyes felt it all. Not as fear, but as pressure. 1,000 observations pressing inward, trying to collapse her into something smaller, something easier to define. She could almost sense the branching predictions forming around her. Millions of possible reactions, each one feeding into the core above, refining humanity's classification in real time. She inhaled slowly. The air was perfectly regulated, stripped of any natural variation. It carried no scent, no warmth, just neutrality. Designed to remove variables, designed to keep every species functioning within controlled parameters. Even breathing here felt monitored. She could hear the faint hum of the chamber's deeper systems, the invisible machinery that maintained order across galaxies. It had always sounded distant before. Now it felt closer, like something waiting. The Council's decision is final, the core added, its tone unchanged, devoid of malice or empathy. Just completion. Around her, expectation tightened. A shift, a word, a protest. Anything that would confirm what humanity was supposed to be. Leon Reyes did not move. Seconds passed, then more. Enough time for uncertainty to begin forming. Not loudly, not openly, but in the smallest fractures of perfect control. A delay here. A recalibration there. Systems that were never meant to hesitate. Hesitating, because the reaction wasn't coming. Not the one they expected. She exhaled. And then she smiled. It was subtle. So small it should have been irrelevant. But in a chamber built entirely on prediction, it did not fit. Not defiance, not despair, not acceptance. Something else. Something that didn't align with any outcome the Council had prepared for. And in that single quiet moment, the tension in the room changed. Not louder, not sharper, just wrong. Because for the first time since the verdict was spoken, the galaxy's most powerful system began to encounter something it could not immediately resolve. Not the decision, not the consequence, but the human standing in the center of it, smiling like the outcome had already been decided somewhere else. The Council believed control was a matter of access. It always had been. Trade routes defined influence. Communication networks defined truth. Expansion corridors defined destiny. Whoever mapped the stars owned the future that moved through them. It was a system refined over millions of years, perfected through conflict and consensus until no civilization questioned its foundation anymore. And now humanity had just been cut off from all of it. Above the chamber, the verdict core finalized its restriction lattice. Entire sectors surrounding the Sol system dimmed within the holographic map, their connective pathways severed with elegant precision. Authorized lanes collapsed. Diplomatic channels rerouted. Resource flows reclassified. It was not a blockade. It was erasure through isolation. Clean, efficient, permanent. Around the chamber, delegates relaxed into quiet acceptance. The decision had been made. The outcome secured. Humanity would adapt, or fade like so many before it. But Ambassador Leon Reyes did not look like something that had just been contained. She didn't move, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge the shift in the star map above her, because she wasn't looking at it. She was looking past it. And somewhere in that stillness, something ancient in the room, something buried beneath layers of logic and protocol, began to stir. Because what the Council did not understand was that humanity had never treated the map as complete, long before first contact, before faster-than-light travel had been stabilized, before Earth had even known it was not alone. Humans had explored the edges of what shouldn't work. They didn't stop at known physics. They tested the cracks, the anomalies, the places where equations failed quietly instead of loudly, dead zones between stars where sensors returned noise instead of data, gravitational distortions that bent trajectory models into nonsense, regions dismissed by every advanced civilization as inefficient, unstable, or simply irrelevant. Humanity went there anyway, not because it was logical, because it was interesting. And in those ignored spaces, they built. Not empires, not fleets, infrastructure, silent pathways threaded through uncharted physics. Communication relays anchored in dimensions that didn't behave consistently enough to be mapped. Supply lines that didn't follow linear distance but probability itself, appearing where needed, vanishing before they could be traced. While the galaxy expanded outward, humanity had learned to move between. Back in the chamber, the verdict core pulsed again, finalizing enforcement protocols. Across the galaxy, automated systems began sealing Earth's access points. Trade embargoes initialized, navigation grids updated, isolation executed with flawless precision. Everything worked, exactly as designed. And yet, something else began to move. Not within the Council systems, outside them. Across regions that didn't officially exist. At first, it was nothing. A fluctuation too small to register as a threat, a routing anomaly dismissed by lower-tier diagnostics. Then another, and another. Independent, unconnected. Until they weren't. Across multiple restricted sectors, unauthorized signals appeared. Not broadcasts, deliveries, data packets arriving from origins that had no coordinates, supply transfers logged through pathways that did not intersect with any known route, entire communication nodes flickering online for fractions of a second, just long enough to pass information before vanishing again. The Council's systems flagged inconsistencies, attempted trace, failed, because there was nothing to trace through. The pathways weren't hidden, they were unmapped. Inside the chamber, subtle recalibrations began. Delegates didn't speak of it yet, but their systems did. Quietly, internally, feeding new data into models that had never accounted for this variable. Leanne Reyes finally blinked. Just once, and that was enough. Because in that moment, something became clear. Not to her, but to the systems watching her. She wasn't surprised. The verdict core attempted to integrate the anomalies into its predictive framework. For the first time, it couldn't, because the assumption at its foundation had always been the same. Control the map, control the species. But humanity had never relied on the map. And now, as unseen networks activated beyond the edges of understanding, the galaxy's most powerful system began to realize something it had never needed to consider before. It hadn't restricted humanity. It had only removed itself from where humanity actually existed. It began too quietly to be called an event. No alarms, no warnings, no declaration of breach. Just movement. Across the galaxy, systems that had already been marked as restricted flickered. Not with failure, but with presence. Trade nodes long since grayed out registered activity. Communication relays flagged inbound signals that carried no origin signature. Entire logistics chains, sealed by the authority of the Galactic Council, reported successful transfers through routes that did not exist. At first it was dismissed, a minor inconsistency, a delayed shutdown, a harmless echo in the system. Then it happened again, and again, until pattern replaced anomaly. Inside the council chamber, the verdict core reacted, not outwardly, not visibly, but deep within its processing strata. Probability trees began to branch faster than usual, running parallel models to reconcile the discrepancies. Every known variable was accounted for, every possible breach pathway tested. None aligned, because nothing had been breached. There was no intrusion, no forced access, no resistance, only continuation. Ambassador Leanne Reyes stood at the center of it all, her posture unchanged, her expression still carrying that quiet, unshakable certainty. She did not look like someone watching chaos unfold. She looked like someone watching confirmation. Above her, the holographic star map began to shift, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but subtly, in ways that should have been impossible under restriction protocols. Lines that had been severed remained disconnected, and yet data flowed between them anyway. Entire regions marked as isolated continued to function as if isolation had never occurred. The Council had closed every door, and humanity had simply kept walking. Across distant sectors, automated defense grids attempted to reassert control. Authorization checks failed. Route validations returned null. Enforcement directives looped endlessly, unable to locate the pathways they were meant to block. Because the pathways weren't there, not in any space the Council could measure. Inside the chamber, delegates began to notice, not through announcement but through absence of expected outcome. The stillness shifted. Calculations stalled. For the first time in recorded council history, a decision did not produce the result it was designed to guarantee. And that was impossible. The verdict core pulsed once, twice, its light fracturing slightly as deeper layers of analysis activated. It reached outward through every network, every system, every controlled corridor of the galaxy, searching, mapping, reasserting, and finding nothing, because there was nothing to control, only a reality where control no longer applied. Leon Reyes finally moved. A single step forward, it echoed, not loudly, but clearly enough that every system, every sensor, every consciousness in the chamber registered it as a shift. She lifted her gaze toward the core, not with defiance, not with challenge, but with something far more unsettling. Understanding. "We never needed your systems," she said softly. Her voice wasn't amplified. It didn't need to be, because every translation field in the chamber carried it instantly, perfectly without distortion, like the statement itself refused to be misinterpreted. "You built your power on controlling where things can go," she continued. A pause. Across the galaxy, more restricted sectors lit with quiet activity, untraceable, unstoppable. "But we learned to move where nothing was supposed to exist." Silence followed. Not the structured silence of diplomacy. Something deeper. The kind that forms when certainty collapses but hasn't yet been replaced. Around her, civilizations that had once defined the limits of expansion, communication, and control began to confront a realization they could not immediately process. Humanity had not broken their system. It had simply never been inside it. And as that truth settled, slow, heavy, irreversible, the smile on Leon Reyes's face finally made sense. Not as defiance, not as arrogance, but as the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen the outcome. Long before the galaxy even understood the game it was playing, the chamber did not erupt into chaos. It quieted. Not the controlled silence of diplomacy, engineered, expected, rehearsed, but something deeper. A silence that spread through systems, through thought, through the unspoken certainty that had always defined the Galactic Council, and was now unraveling without resistance. Above Ambassador Leon Reyes, the verdict core dimmed, not in failure, in hesitation. Its vast lattice of logic, built from the combined reasoning of civilizations that had survived extinction, war, and time itself, continued to process, continued to calculate, continued to search for a pathway that restored alignment between decision and outcome. It found none, because for the first time since its creation, the core was not dealing with opposition. It was dealing with irrelevance. Across the chamber, delegates remained motionless but not out of discipline. Their systems were recalibrating, silently, urgently, trying to reconcile a truth that did not fit within any established hierarchy. Species that had once measured power through fleets, territory, and control of information now found themselves confronting something far more destabilizing. A civilization that did not require permission to function. Outside the chamber, the galaxy continued. Trade flowed. Signals moved. Entire regions marked as restricted operated without interruption, as if the Council's authority had become a suggestion rather than a law. And no system could explain why. Leon Reyes turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the vast assembly. For a moment she said nothing. She didn't need to. The room had already reached the conclusion words would only delay. They hadn't limited humanity. They had revealed it. Not as a threat. Not as a rival. But as something that existed beyond the structures they had spent millions of years perfecting. She took a step toward the exit corridor. No guards moved to stop her. No protocol activated, because every system that might have intervened had already reached the same unresolved state. No valid reason to interfere. The core pulsed once more, faintly this time attempting a final classification update. Its internal models strained to define humanity's position within the galactic order. Threat, ally, variable, anomaly. Each category collapsed before completion, because humanity was not occupying a position within the system anymore. It had stepped outside of it. A veiled delegate attempted to initiate dialogue, a soft cascade of light forming words that dissolved before fully stabilizing. Even communication, it seemed, struggled to adapt to a framework that no longer held. The Threx War representatives remained still, their towering forms no longer projecting dominance but calculation. Not of how to confront humanity, but of how to understand it. Leanne reached the threshold of the chamber and paused. Not dramatically, not for effect, just long enough for the moment to settle into something permanent. Then without turning back, she spoke. "You didn't notice," she said quietly. Her voice carried, not through amplification but through the absence of anything left to compete with it. A pause, a breath. The smile wasn't confidence. Another step forward. It was confirmation. She walked on. And behind her, the Galactic Council, an institution that had defined reality for civilizations across galaxies, remained suspended in a state it had never been designed to experience. Not defeat. Not destruction. But the irreversible realization that its authority had always depended on something it had never questioned, that everything important existed within its reach. And as that belief collapsed slowly and silently, one truth remained, echoing far beyond the chamber, beyond the systems that had tried to contain it into a galaxy that was just beginning to understand. The most dangerous power humanity possessed was never the one you could see.